My Lords, the virtual proceedings on the question for short debate in the name of Lord Jermyn will now commence. I will first call Lord Jermyn, then I will call each speaker on the list in the usual way. Please ensure that you unmute your microphone prior to speaking. Your microphone will be returned to mute when you have finished speaking. In accordance with guidance agreed by the Procedure Committee, if your name is not listed, it is not possible to take part in proceedings. I will now hand over to the Earl of Courton, the Government Whip, to remind us of time limits.
My Lords, can I just remind you, as Honourable Lord Muffall said, that this is a time-limited debate and the timing available to all peers is very tight indeed. In fact, it's 2 minutes per peer. My Lords, in the previous debate, Noble Lords did actually keep to the time limit and the Minister was able to respond in full. If you take up more than your time, allotted time now, the Minister, my noble friend Lord Keane, will be unable to respond to all of it. So please do keep to the 2 minute time limit. Many thanks.
Thank you. Question for short debate, COVID-19, prisoners and rehabilitation. Lord Jermyn.
Thank you. My Lords, in this debate, the government, I think, has three big questions to answer. The first one is, has the government failed in its duty of care to prison staff and prisoners? And the second one is, have the government's actions to date been too little and too late? And the third one is, are the government's actions sufficient to safeguard the public from the community spread of coronavirus? Has it adequately ensured that the safety of the public has not been put at risk? I'd like to thank all the organisations who provided me with supporting evidence to understand these key questions, and in particular the Howard League for Penal Reform, the Prison Reform Trust and Women in Prison. I also want to acknowledge that the government has limited room for manoeuvre given the systemic problems over many years within our prison system. Problems of overcrowding, maintenance backlogs, and inadequate support to prepare people for release. So to my first question, has the government failed in its duty of care? Well, we've just got to look at the statistics on virus transmission to identify the scale of the problem. The first reported coronavirus case in a prison in England and Wales occurred on the 18th of March. By April the 1st, there were 88 cases among staff and prisoners. By the 8th of April, that number rose to 177. By April the 15th, it rose to 300. And on Tuesday of this week, it rose again to 534. Now, these figures demonstrate an exponential rise and no sign of a flattening curve. In fact, in the last week alone, the number of cases has risen from 269 to 534. And that itself is 6 times higher than it was on April the 1st. And sadly, prisoners, prison officers and staff have died from coronavirus. I ask the Minister to provide us with the latest details. Isolation, social distancing, testing and wearing of protective equipment are the actions we would expect to be undertaken by government to protect prisoners and staff alike. Our overcrowded prisons make it very difficult to isolate or develop social distancing. By way of example, Swansea, the most overcrowded prison in England and Wales, is supposed to hold no more than 250 men, but at the end of February, it held 436. The government response is to create 3 cohorts of prisoner and try to isolate one from the other. Those with coronavirus symptoms, those who might have been exposed to the virus or new to prison, and a vulnerable group to be shielded. To create the space for this to happen, the government announced it will build 2,000 temporary cells. So can the Minister tell us how many of these have now been built and how many of them are occupied? Also, how many prisoners are currently required to share a cell or sleep in a dormitory? And is the wearing of PPE compulsory for staff? And can the Minister confirm reports of woefully low numbers of available equipment? And given the example of Her Majesty's Prison Berwyn in Wrexham, our largest prison, where 60% of the cells are designed to hold 2 people, which was built in breach of United Nations minimum standards, social distancing is impossible. I'm afraid that the conclusion reached is that because of a failure of testing, availability of PPE, isolation and social distancing, and the exponential rise in coronavirus cases, our prisons are incubators, pumping the virus and spreading it to the community, both within and outside their walls. For the 17,000 prisoners sharing a cell, whether the virus is contracted is truly a terrifying lottery. On my second question, have government actions been too little and too late? I turn to the government's key proposal to reduce the spread of the virus by creating more space in the prison system through the early release of prisoners. Now, there's confusion on how many prisoners are to be released. The government says 4,000 plus pregnant women prisoners, but we're told that Public Health England and Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service have recommended a reduction of 15,000 prisoners to properly safeguard both prisoners and staff. But my lords, either way, progress has been painfully slow to reach even the lower government target. Only 17 of the 70 pregnant women have been released, and the end of custody temporary release scheme has only released a handful, and just 4, my lords, by the 14th of April. And if that's still the case, well, it gives us a grand total of 21, nowhere near the 4,000 the government says, and nowhere near the 15,000 the prison service says. This rate of release is too slow and too late to save lives and avoid a public health catastrophe, both within prisons and beyond. And my lords, those are not my words, but the words of the Secretary of State for Justice announcing the release scheme earlier. So my question is, has the ECTR scheme been restarted, and how many have now been released? And has the government got sufficient powers to facilitate early release? And if not, why haven't they taken them? Meanwhile, new prisoners are being admitted. So can the noble Lord the Minister tell the House how many prisoners have been admitted to prison in the last month, and also how many prisoners are being held on remand? All around the globe, countries are releasing prisoners under strict conditions. The Ministry of Justice response falls way below any international comparator, and indeed in the UK below that of Northern Ireland and probably Scotland as well. The scientific advice is quite clear. The risk of infection is much higher in congregate settings like prisons. So the fewer the people in those settings, the better. And there is a similar situation, my lords, which applies in immigration detention centres. And by definition, these people are not criminals, and they're certainly definitely vulnerable. So finally to my third question, is public health adequately safeguarded by the government's actions? My lords, prisons are not places of total isolation. 50,000 staff and workers enter and leave daily. Goods and services arrive and leave. Prison staff have woefully low items of PPE equipment, and nearly a quarter of staff are self-isolating at home. And the reduced numbers serving the prison population have resulted in lock-ins for 23 hours at a time, with often more than one person in a cell. Testing of staff has only just started, and those tested are a tiny proportion of staff overall. As the expert advisor, Professor Croker, says, closed environments contribute to secondary transmission of COVID-19 and promote super-spreading events. Closed environments are consistent with large-scale COVID-19 transmission events, such as that of the ski chalet associated cluster in France and the church and hospital associated clusters in South Korea. So to my conclusion, my lords, well, it is this, that the government response to the pandemic in respect of the prison and probation service has been inadequate and lacking in urgency. What we have witnessed is too little and too slow. Urgent action is needed to save lives. In these exceptional circumstances, the government must accelerate and widen the release scheme, including vulnerable offenders, children and pregnant women. Only then will prisons have the space to isolate and undertake some social distancing. And we need a presumption against short prison sentences. You know, short-term prison sentences don't generally work anyway. The government's been looking at this very carefully. So sending more people to prison for a short time is a double whammy to beat the pandemic. The prisoner state is now a perfect crucible for the disease. The dangers have been pointed out to the government, but they appear reticent to act. This has put prisoners and prison staff in danger. The government has failed in its duty of care, sleepwalking into a crisis which it must avoid. Prisons were already overstretched and overcrowded before coronavirus. Adding this crisis on top makes it a perfect storm for our prison and probation services. I therefore look forward to the Minister's response to these problems.
Lord Naseby.
My Lords, I live just outside Bedford, the home of John Howard, the prison reformer, and it has a prison, a very old prison with some modifications, supposed to hold 500. The latest figure I've got is 900 plus, and that reflects all the points that Lord Jermyn has said. I would like to ask the Secretary of State, though, in particular, why in Scotland, when provision is made, as there is everywhere else, that there shall be no visitors and no education, in Scotland they are allowing prisoners to have some form of communication with their loved ones. Why on earth can we not do that in the United Kingdom? And I come also to this key point about the Prison Governors Association's figures. They are recommending 15,000 be released because they know the staff shortages, they know the difficulties, they know the challenges. So I say to your lordships, and in particular to the Minister, why can't we be brave for once and have some real urgency? I've had to do it in my life with a 3-day week, and I can remember that very clearly. It was done in Calcutta when I worked there, and there was a particular problem. So I was asked the Minister, take 15,000 as your target figure. And if you may not quite make it, so be it. But if you can get somewhere near it, then every one of us in the House of Lords and in the Commons who are politicians can say, thank you, we will have done some good to poor souls who are worried stiff at this moment.
Lord Harris of Haringey.
My Lords, I am grateful to have the opportunity to speak, albeit very briefly, in this debate. I expect some will be surprised that time is being devoted to this topic. Yet what happens in our prisons must not be swept under the carpet and ignored. People in detention are totally dependent on the state for their treatment and care, and Article 2 of the ECHR places a special duty on the state to protect those in custody. 110 years ago, Winston Churchill, then Home Secretary, speaking in the other place, said, "The mood and temper of the public in regard to the treatment of crime and criminals is one of the most unfailing tests of the civilization of any country." And those words set a context for today's debate. 6 years ago, I conducted a review for the MOJ. Our prisons then were grotesquely overcrowded and staffing levels were inadequate. I concluded that prisoners were being kept in grim environments, bleak and demoralising to the spirit. One can only imagine what it is like now with permanent lockdown and disease stalking the corridors. Given the stretched staffing, can the noble and learned Lord the Minister tell us what proportion of prison officers are ill or in quarantine? I understand that as of Sunday, 278 prisoners have tested positive for COVID-19 across 64 prisons. What are today's figures? And if the Minister does not have these, why not? There's a duty of care here. How many deaths have there been? And what are the numbers of prisoners who have died from respiratory or other illness but were not tested for COVID-19 in the last 2 months? Are prisoners' families being informed that their relative has got the virus or have the symptoms? And what steps are being taken to keep worried families informed? And finally, given the Article 2 obligations, and notwithstanding the provisions in the recent Coronavirus Act that COVID-related deaths are not notifiable, will all deaths of prisoners be subject to proper, effective external investigation and scrutiny? I look forward to the noble and learned Lord's response.
Lord McNally.
My Lords, between 2010 and 2017, I spent 7 years at the Ministry of Justice, first as Minister of State and then as Chair of the Youth Justice Board for England and Wales, and visited many prisons and youth offender institutes. And I never left any of those bodies without a sense of awe for those who work within them doing a very difficult and sometimes dangerous job on behalf of us all. A month ago, Sir Bob Neal, the chairman of the Justice Committee in the other place, called for immediate publication of contingency plans to deal with what he called the potential for a hotbed of viral transmission in our prisons. The reason we're having this debate today and why Lord Jermyn, Naseby and Harris have opened with such passion is that there is a growing feeling that ministers in the Ministry of Justice are not up to responding to that call for action. The Minister will be aware of the briefings that noble lords will receive from NACRO, the Prison Reform Trust, the Howard League, the Quakers and others. It's impossible to cover all their concerns in a 2-minute speech. So will the Minister deposit in the library a comprehensive response to the concerns raised in those briefings by these very expert organisations? Will prison staff and prisoners now be given the testing and safety equipment to manage the threats of the coronavirus safely, as is happening in the hospitals and in the care homes? And will the Secretary of State take one of the Downing Street press conferences accompanied by the head of the prison service so he can explain to the media and the British public what is happening in our prisons on his watch? My lords, unless we hear an action this day response from the Minister, there is a very real danger of prisons being added to the list of too little, too late responses, which has blighted the record of this government in response to this pandemic.
Lord Ramsbottom.
My lords, I congratulate the noble Lord Jermyn on tabling this very important question, and I look forward to the noble and learned Lord the Minister's response, because at second reading I raised the point that although 84 of the 121 prisons are overcrowded, and a draft operating model for the future of probation services had only just been published, there was no mention of either prisons or probation in the coronavirus bill. The Minister, summing up, the noble Lord Bethan, assured me that the Secretary of State for Justice has advised that powers that exist are considered sufficient as far as the needs of prisons and the probation service at this time. Yet only a week later, emergency release of 4,000 remand and low-risk prisoners was announced, but nothing was said about probation services. A number of prisoners have fallen victim to the virus, from which some have tragically died. Like the noble Lord Harris, my question to the noble and learned Lord is whether families are being kept informed of the well-being of relatives who are suffering. Public Health England experts are said to advise single-cell occupancy, to achieve which the Chief Executive of HMPPS told the Justice Select Committee on the 7th of April would require the release of between 10 and 15,000 prisoners. My second question to the noble and learned Lord is whether single-cell occupancy is a government intent.
The Lord Bishop of Gloucester.
My lords, I'd like to echo what has been said already, and I draw attention to my register of interest, particularly the fact that I'm president of the Nelson Trust. Just a few points. The Secretary of State has argued that the public wouldn't accept the early release of certain categories of prisoners. Well, the government needs to be clearer with the public about the risks in a pandemic for prisoners, key workers and their families. The potential risk of low-level, non-violent offenders released on licence is far outweighed by the risk of inaction and delay. Will the government commit to putting into the public domain as soon as possible substantial and transparent information about how the release programme is working and publish daily statistics about coronavirus in prison, including the impact on staff and those in custody? And then secondly, concerning the slow release of pregnant women and those with infants, What is the government's plan to maximise use of the voluntary sector's capacity and experience? Can I urge the government to fully involve the community? Women's centres specialise in this sort of work. Charities like Children Heard and Seen and Birthrights are doing remarkable work, as are faith groups. In this pandemic, good things are happening in the community, and the justice system should be no exception. And then finally, one burden of this situation weighs heavily on prisoners' children who may be too young to understand why they can't visit or have contact as usual. Where mothers in particular are given a short sentence for a non-violent offence, surely we do society far more harm than good by keeping them in custody rather than out on licence during this pandemic. At the very least, can the Noble Lord the Minister ensure all children with a parent in prison will be able to have regular free telephone contact with their parent? My Lords, these are difficult times and urgent action is required.
Lord Farmer.
My Lords, I too congratulate the Noble Lord German on initiating this important debate. Maintaining family and other relational ties, as the Lord Bishop of Gloucester has just mentioned, is indispensable to prevent reoffending. Having people to go straight for provides the all-important motivation to engage in the other rehabilitation activities. So whilst cancelling visits was necessary, I'm relieved that mitigating this appears to be an overriding government priority, with 900 handsets provided for establishments without in-cell telephony. The prison service is also piloting video calls at 6 prisons. The rollout of virtual calls across the whole estate can and should be done at pace, because there have been various previous trials of video calling technology on which the new pilots can build. As 60% of female prisoners have dependent children, their estate should be prioritised. Learning from other government programmes, could the prison service not deploy an ongoing test and learn approach? Rather than waiting for perfection, safety and functioning can be constantly improved in the current crisis when time is of the essence. Progress should then help ensure widespread business as usual use of technology we have all rapidly become very accustomed to using. Obviously, public opinion can be antagonistic, but there has never been a better time for people to grasp that deprivation of liberty is the punishment for those in prison, not the destruction of family relationships or prohibited access to means of communication, which are becoming indispensable for most of us and similarly vital to prisoners' successful reintegration in mainstream society. Will the Minister update us on the progress being made in the provision of virtual visits? Also, how will suspension of prison visits be lifted across the board or by establishment and dependent on infection rates? Finally, what is being done to ensure safer custody hotlines are working so that families can express fears about prisoners and receive a response? Thank you.
Baroness Healy of Primrose Hill.
My Lords, the government must act now and release women on mother and baby units and pregnant prisoners. We know how urgent it is to reduce the overcrowded prison population during this pandemic in order to stop the deaths of inmates and staff. Already 13 inmates and 4 prison officers have sadly died. Hundreds of prisoners and staff have tested positive for COVID-19. Women on short sentences do not need a risk assessment in this time of national emergency. They just need to be released. Half have children under 18. What has happened to the promised release scheme for 1,000 prisoners? 4th of April, then suspended on the 18th. Can the Minister say how many pregnant women prisoners have been? We know of only 17 so far. Does the Minister know how many babies and toddlers are currently in prison who have mothers? Urgent action must be taken to ensure their safety. Women in prison are also mothers of children in the community who are suffering great anxiety. Schools closed and grandparents self-isolating. They need access to their mothers. Yet all visits have been stopped since March 13th. How can this government say it believes families with rehabilitation? There are not enough phones in cells, despite government claims, children to contact their mothers, and use of communal phones increases the risk of infection. Short sentences are increasingly criticised. Now is the time to abandon them. Cease sending more of them to prison, especially on recall and remand, and ensure suspended sentences and community orders are the norm. Government has a chance to make a difference, save more lives, help the NHS, and allow the prison service to concentrate on rehabilitation in prisons by implementing the promised early release scheme.
Baroness Humphreys.
My Lords, Parliament as well as the government has a duty of care to those within the prison system, staff and prisoners alike, so I'm grateful to my noble friend for securing this debate. In what is already a very complex situation, Wales's devolution settlement adds another layer of complexity. Justice and therefore responsibility for prisoner release, for example, is a matter reserved to the UK government, whereas primary and secondary healthcare related to public sector prisons in Wales is devolved. At this point, I'd like to acknowledge the role of Public Health Wales and the Welsh Government in this crisis. They have a vital role to play in providing funding and looking after the well-being of prisoners as they are released. And I know they're working closely with the Prison and Probation Service and local authorities to ensure that suitable accommodation is in place. Overcrowding in prison in Wales, as we've already heard, is an ongoing problem, with Swansea being the most overcrowded prison in England and Wales. In view of this, could the Minister tell us how many prisoners have been given early release from Welsh prisons and how many more are planned? The UK government has apparently announced plans to install 500 temporary single occupancy cells in 7 prisons in England in an attempt to expand capacity. Will we see at least one similar project in one of Wales's overcrowded prisons? And could the Minister update us on the number of COVID-19 cases within prisons in Wales? It would be very useful if, in future, statistics could be produced individually for both countries so that the performance of both governments in their respective areas can be monitored and both can be held to account.
Baroness Bennett of Manor Castle.
My Lords, I thank Lord German for securing this debate and his excellent introduction. Many of the questions I had listed have already been asked, but I do particularly want to focus on the excellent suggestion from the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Gloucester, that we should see daily reports on numbers in prison, the numbers released, the number of infections, so we can monitor what's happening. And I'd also second the comments of Baroness Healy, the noble lady, regarding female prisoners and their particular vulnerabilities. But I want to take this brief time to focus on a group of people who are not prisoners, who are not criminals and not accused of any crime, and that is people in immigration detention centres, and also people who are seeking asylum and are housed in what's often very much inappropriate housing conditions, under being forced by the government to be in those locations. So in Portugal, they have given full citizenship rights to migrants and asylum seekers for the course of the virus. Is that something the government will consider? Will it think about doing that? Will it look specifically at freeing everyone from an immigration detention centre and providing them with appropriate accommodation and housing and support? And particularly, I'd express the concern that the South Yorkshire Migration and Asylum Action Group has expressed about Urban House in Wakefield and the conditions there, where 180 people are sharing one set of a group of toilets, and it's gone up from cleaning from once a day to twice a day, but some people don't want to be there for obvious reasons of concern. So we need to focus on the detention centres, but coming back to the prisons, there is one final question that I'd like to ask the Minister, a specific question. How many of the residents, the about 82,000 residents in jails now, are scheduled to be released in the next 12 months? And isn't there an argument for releasing all of those given the expected duration of the corona crisis?
Lord Woolf.
I also congratulate my Lords, Lord German, on this excellent debate. It has given a very clear picture of the tragic situation which exists at the moment in the prisons. This month is the 30th anniversary of the Strange Ways report, which I made into the prison. I'm sad to say that the conditions which we've talked about and which have been clearly stated by those who've gone before me in the debate has not improved at all. It is a disgrace that it has not done so. And this was bound to happen sooner or later, that we have a combination of intolerable conditions in the prisons, which in itself is a risk to the public. I will therefore just confine the rest of the time I've got to one matter, and that is remand prisoners. They haven't been found guilty of any offence. The fact that they're on remand speaks for itself. And the situation, as I understand it, is that the guidance that has been given to prison governors doesn't cover remand prisoners, so they're not being included. I'd also want to refer to one specific case. It's been drawn to mine and Lord McNally's attention. Like myself, the Lord McNally is aware of a father known to both of us who is desperately worried about an asthmatic son of 35 who at present time has been remanded in custody to await extradition to the USA at Wandsworth Prison. Conditions are such that they fall within the descriptions we've heard. At Christmas 2015, for 4 days, he removed his daughter from the care of a mother. He recognizes and accepts what he did was wrong and contrary to a court order, but he was lonely and foolish. Having been released on bail there, he negotiated, and negotiations took place with his father. What they offered was that if he pleaded guilty, he could have a sentence of 8 years imprisonment. That's on top of the time he spent
It's time to bring your speech to a close, Lord Wolf.
Yes, thank you. I'll stop.
Lord Blencathra.
My Lords, I take a generally different view from all the comments expressed so far. We all accept that coronavirus causes difficulties in prisons, since physical distancing is difficult, if not impossible. And even if prisoners were locked in their cells individually for 24 hours per day, coronavirus will still spread, and I think that is inevitable. I reject the view that we should release as many prisoners as possible and not send any more to prison for short sentences. First of all, it is our prime duty to protect the public. Courts these days send only fairly serious and habitual offenders to prison. If a judge at the present moment thinks that someone should be in prison for even a few months, then you can bet your bottom dollar that that person deserves it. Giving them a community sentence instead is not an alternative. It never has been, and it never will be. Second, we must do all that we can to protect prison officers who are far more deserving of protection. I don't know how to do that, but they are a greater priority than prisoners. Whether that means some sort of PPE when it is available, or keeping prisoners in lockdown, the proper use of that ghastly word, then so be it. Third, it is perfectly acceptable and desirable to release early pregnant women and minor offenders who are near the end of their sentence. That should be under licence and not until they are tagged. Finally, my Lords, I read yesterday, and this was not in the Daily Mail, that the Ministry of Justice is considering putting up released prisoners in travel lodges or Premier Inns. That is unbelievable, as was an approach made by the Ministry of Justice to Butlins a few weeks ago, also looking for accommodation. I appreciate the desire to ensure that released prisoners are not wandering the streets, committing more crimes, but how will the British public see that? This year, millions of our people will not be able to afford a few weeks in Butlins or nights in travel lodges, and they will be appalled that released prisoners should get treatment that they, as honest people, can't afford. I urge the MOJ to drop this idea, and I ask my noble and learned friend to say that this will not happen. Thank you.
Lord Dubbs.
My Lords, my congratulations to the noble Lord Chairman. I have to differ from the noble Lord Blencathra. You won't be surprised if I say that. My Lords, over a month ago, the Prison Governors Association warned the government that there was a high risk of COVID-19 because of the overcrowding in our prisons and an aging prison population. And that risk is both to prisoners and to the prison officers and to the other staff working there. And half of all prisons in England and Wales have confirmed cases of the virus. We've already heard that to achieve single cell occupancy, between 10,000 and 15,000 prisoners would have to be released. But what's happened so far? The government announced plans to release 4,000. Only a handful have to date been released. I think of the 70 pregnant women and mothers, only 17 have been released. And if mothers in prison have children at home, visiting is now impossible, and that is an additional punishment for that of being in prison, never anticipated when the sentence was first imposed. But I think we do need to increase the scope of the temporary release scheme. We should release pregnant women and mothers, and where prisoners are not a threat to the public, and we're talking about mainly category D prisoners who have already been risk assessed, they should be able to go home on extended releases on temporary license. And of course, immigration detention should be applied similarly. Lastly, may I say this, that there's concern that the public would not accept the early release of prisoners. Bearing in mind, we're talking about prisoners who would not be deemed to be a threat to the community. I would argue this, that when the courts initially sentenced a lot of the people in our prison, there was no knowledge of the virus. There was no knowledge that being in prison might be a death sentence. There was no knowledge that there would be a breach of family relationships because visiting would be impossible. Had the courts known that, I think they would have approached some of the sentences differently. That is my argument, and that is why I think the government today should approach some of these sentences differently and release some of these people.
Lord Hastings of Scarisbrick.
I thank Lord Jermyn as well for the opportunity given to all of us to discuss the vital matter of justice. And I want to begin by referring to the letter sent to every prisoner by Phil Coppell, the Director General of...
Could the noble Lord speak nearer the microphone, please?
I certainly will do that as best I can. I want to refer to the letter from Phil Coppell, who sent a note to every prisoner at the beginning of the lockdown, in which he said they needed to have forbearance, as patient self-control, restraint and tolerance. And then he assured them that the prison service would look after them with humanity and with due dignity. Well, I made an inquiry of a number of people that I know inside the prison service, asked how their experience was, and I'll quote just 3 of them. This is first of all from a prisoner in a prison in Surrey. I've been treated poorly throughout the period of the lockdown. I've been provided with no updates as to what the lockdown means, other than to remain in my cell until further notice. I've been provided with very limited telephone usage, limited sanitation, and no means to cope with prolonged confinement and no education. Another prisoner in Kent, no communication or update whatsoever with what's going on both inside and outside the jail. 1 hot meal a day at lunchtime and just a baguette at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Basically told to put up and shut up. I've not been seen by any member of healthcare concerning my well-known mental health issues and my skin allergies and other aspects of my physical needs, no medical support of any nature. And a final one. People with mental health issues, and this is from a prison in Hampshire, have simply been neglected and are deteriorating because of long periods of confinement to their cells with no regime. My lords, this is a massive failure of human dignity, abruptly disregarded, and I urge the Minister to respond with dignity.
Lord Balfe. Lord Balfe. If not, Lord Faulkner of Worcester.
My lords, we've been told that life in Britain will be different once the COVID-19 emergency is over. I hope that one change will be in the approach we adopt towards Britain's prisons and the men and women who are held there. The prison service has struggled to contain overcrowding for at least the last 50 years. Measures to reduce the prison population have been discussed continuously during that time. Governments have sometimes expressed themselves as being in favour, but far too little has been done to bring that about. The Crime, Justice and Protecting the Public White Paper in 1990, Lord Wolfe will remember, described them as an expensive way of making bad people worse. Noble Lords will rightly recoil from the idea of executive release to cancel the effect of a sentence lawfully imposed by the court. But we now have the situation when a prison sentence carries with it a real risk to the life of a prisoner or of prison staff because of the conditions inside the cells in half of which the coronavirus is present. There has always been a time when prisoners have died in prison. For some time now, there have been over 300 a year, a third of them by their own hand. But we have to go back to the time of the great 18th century prison reformer John Howard, after whom the Howard League is named, and who was referred to by the noble Lord Naseby earlier, to find dangers similar to those we have today because of COVID-19. In preparing for this debate, I spoke to someone who works at Her Majesty's Prison, Ewell in Worcestershire, described last year by HMIP as squalid, demeaning and depressing. As far as spreading the coronavirus is concerned, he said the prison was as dangerous as a cruise ship, worse in many ways, as the cells are smaller than a typical ship's cabin. As so many other countries have decided, and so many of your lordships have said in this debate, the release of prisoners has now become not just a matter of compassion and humanity, but of practical necessity to save lives.
Lord Balfe, whom I believe is unmuted. Lord Balfe.
Yes, thank you. I thought I was being unmuted centrally. Can I thank Lord Jermyn for initiating this debate? I want to say a few words on behalf of what I consider as the forgotten public service, and that's the Prison Officers Association, the trade union that covers prison officers, some 37,500 members, of whom 7,000, roughly 1 in 5 of the membership, are self-isolating. 4 of the members have died of coronavirus, and 231 of their members have tested positive. Now, members will remember, I've argued in the past, it's quite legitimate to have a tough prison regime, but we have to remember the people who look after the prisoners, and we have to make sure that everyone who is in prison has a decent standard of life. There's nothing wrong with locking people up. There's a lot wrong with not giving them a decent standard. I want to ask the Minister to consider 3 issues which the Prison Officers Association regard as a high priority. Firstly, testing should be made available for all prison officers. Apart from anything else, a number of those 7,000 who are self-isolating would be found not to be carrying the disease and could be back at work, which would help the service. Secondly, there is a great lack of PPE equipment. Most officers in most prisons do not have access to a full range of equipment. Much of it is inadequate, and much of what is supposed to be there is missing. Can the Minister assure us that the same priority that's being given to NHS outlets will be given to prison outlets so that prison officers can be properly protected? And the third issue is the recognition as key workers. A number of supermarkets, for instance, have refused to recognise prisoners as key workers. Could the government make it very clear that prison officers are key workers? Thank you very much.
Lord Singh of Wimbledon.
My Lords, I'd like to begin by first of all thanking the noble Lord Jermyn for securing this important debate and to declare my interest as founder and director of the Sikh Chaplaincy Service UK. Our prisons are grossly overcrowded, with more people being sent to prison in proportion to population than in almost any other European country. We've spoken about overcrowding and the need for reform before, but the added risk to health from COVID-19 gives us an imperative to look again at reducing numbers by first tackling the needs of the most vulnerable inmates. I'm particularly concerned about mothers in prison, single mothers and expectant mothers, who in addition to their original sentence are now deprived of visits by children because of the pandemic. Worse, wholly innocent children are now being punished through lack of contact. I think a small step in the right direction would be to give mothers with no history of violence early temporary release or early parole, which could later perhaps be extended with perhaps a community penalty. Similarly, consideration should also be given for vulnerable male prisoners. My Lords, COVID-19 should be seen as an opportunity to trial long-needed reforms.
Lord Marks of Henley-on-Thames.
My Lords, this debate is hard to wind up in 2 minutes, but I thank my noble friend Lord Jermyn for securing it and for opening it so thoroughly. Even virtually, my Lords, this House has been at its best, with unanimity -1 in demanding humanity, compassion, and a practical but civilized approach. We've consistently railed against the lamentable state of our prisons, demanding fewer prisoners, an end to overcrowding, increased staffing, improved living conditions, more purposeful activity, and a limit to time spent locked in cells. Our aim has been rehabilitation. Now with COVID-19, the same action is essential to keep prisoners and staff safe and save lives. The government's first duty is to protect our citizens, all our citizens, including prisoners. We have together identified today the actions we know must be taken. To end cell sharing, enable social distancing, and ease pressure on staff, we must cut prisoner numbers by 15,000, and now. By ending the short sentences and by implementing early and temporary release schemes with tagging as necessary, as other countries have done. We need more staff, intensively trained to make up shortages and cover for the large numbers off work, so prisoners can eat, work, attend training and exercise outside their cells for reasonable times in safety. 23-hour+ days locked in cells are not acceptable. We must provide full testing and prompt access to physical and mental medical care with PPE for staff and prisoners who need it. My Lords, the government knows the urgency, but it has been slow generally in this crisis, the MOJ hopelessly so on prisons. What action will the government take? My Lords, the delay is costing lives.
Lord Ponsonby of Shoolbred.
My Lords, I too would like to thank Lord Jermyn. I think he opened this debate extremely effectively, and there's been a real sense of urgency and exasperation from all the peers who've spoken in this important debate. My Lord, since 2010, thousands of prison officers have been axed by the Conservative governments, and this has been driving a crisis in our prisons, and it's been exacerbating the level of violence and affecting prisoner care. Even before the pandemic started, prison violence was out of control with 33,000 recorded annual assaults, double the level of 2010. There were over 10,000 assaults against prison staff, and in the last 12 months, more than triple. That's more than triple than it was 10 years ago. My Lords, I want to pick up a point made by Lord Balfe regarding prison officers, and it's in the form of a question for the Minister. A significant worry for prison officers is in bringing the virus back to their home from the workplace and infecting vulnerable members of their family. Will the Minister join with me in congratulating the hotel chain Centre Parks for offering free accommodation to prison officers during this outbreak? And will he urge other hotel chains to offer free accommodation to prison officers? A second question to the Minister is, I understand it is practice for some prisoners to be sent to care homes when they're near death for the last days and weeks of their lives. Can the Minister tell me whether prisoners sent to care homes to die have a coronavirus test before they're sent to those care homes? My Lord, that's all the questions I have.
Minister, Lord Keane of Ely. Minister. I think we'll wait for the Minister.
Yes, if we
very
wait.
kind of you to wait for the Minister. Can you hear me, Speaker?
Yep, fine now. Thank you.
Thank you. Like other noble lords, I would like to thank Lord Jermyn for securing this debate. If I appear to move at speed as I address these matters, it's because I want to address as many of the questions raised as I possibly can in the time available. Now, of course, COVID-19 does present a unique set of challenges that we must address in order to maintain the provision of custody services. And we are working very closely with Public Health England to ensure our approach is based on the best scientific advice that's available. Our first challenge was to ensure that we had a safe operating procedure, and we implemented what were termed exceptional delivery models with heavily restricted regimes that implemented social distancing measures. And this put in place temporary measures to restrict regimes and cease all non-essential activities involving groups of people. And that includes social visits, education, non-essential work and association that's already been touched upon. We also restricted movements between prisons to prevent the disease spreading from prison to prison. And most importantly, we took a range of measures to ensure we had resilient staffing levels available with robust contingencies, and I'll come back to that. I have to say that prison staff have stepped up terrifically, and we are doing all we can to celebrate what they've been doing through the #Hidden Heroes campaign, and we would welcome support of that campaign across government. Now, we've adapted the way we use the prison estate. We're putting in place units to isolate the ill, units to shield the vulnerable, and units to manage the risk from new prisoners. And taking these measures required that we have headroom between the prison population and prison capacity. And we are moving towards the necessary headroom through a number of measures and developments. And the first one I'll mention is this. There has been a fall in the prison population due to the upstream changes in law enforcement and court activity. And indeed, the prison population has fallen by about 2,500 since the start of the pandemic as a result of this. We are taking measures to expedite remand hearings. We're implementing the new end of custody temporary release scheme, and I'll touch upon that again. And we are establishing alternative accommodation, including additional temporary accommodation in North Sea Camp, Little Hay and High Point. And there will be a rapid expansion of this. And for resilience during what is clearly going to be a difficult period, we're making sure that we have sufficient staff available at the front line. We're also working closely with the Department of Health, and we have a clear PPE plan and have commenced staff testing in line with other key workers. Now, can I then touch upon a number of the points raised by Noble Lords, in particular, Lord German? He began by referring to statistics. Let me be clear, we do make a daily report in press release of relevant statistics from the prison estate. And the figures that I have, which differ, I have to say, from his, are that as at, I think, 21st April, we had 300 prisoners who tested positive for COVID-19 across 69 prisons. We had 237 prison staff who tested positive across 57 prisons, and we had 10 prisoner escort and custody services who'd also tested positive. As at 22nd April, there were 4,439 prison staff not working due to COVID-19 related absences. And that leaves us with a staffing level of about 80% against current staffing targets. And sadly, I have to report that there have been 3 prison staff deaths and 15 prisoner deaths with COVID-19. So I hope that assists to some extent. On the matter of cells, in the prison estate, we have something like 17,000 twin cells. The temporary cells that we're bringing forward will be single cells. At the moment, we have about 200 constructed, and we are proceeding with those within the Category D estate as quickly as possible. Lord German also raised the question of PPE for staff, and our position there is that we do have PPE available to staff. We're focused, of course, on social distancing and regular hand washing, but we are using PPE where we need to break social distancing to support close person-to-person operations with prisoners who have suspected or confirmed cases of COVID-19. As regards the actual supply, There is a stock available to the prison service, separate to that of the Department of Health. There have been some short-term supply concerns around coveralls and gloves. So I hope that assists in explaining the position. With regard to overall staff numbers, I've already indicated that we're operating at about 80%. We also have provision for additional staff, having invited recently retired staff to return to the front line. Propose moving about 750 headquarters staff to the front line, and there's also further provision for military personnel to assist if or when ever required. In regard to the testing of staff, I can advise that they are key workers and they are regarded as key workers. And since 9th April, we've been engaging with the Department of Health and Social Care to discuss plans to ensure that these vital key workers are prioritised in the rolling out of the Department of Health testing. And so far, hundreds of staff have been tested, and we're working on a rollout plan to deal with that. Currently, I would add, prisoners are not being tested for COVID-19 unless they are taken to hospital unwell, in which case they will be. Turning to the point raised by the Noble Lord Naseby and the question of communication and contact, we have implemented further steps because of isolation within cells, so that prisoners have free PIN credit per week, allowing for approximately 60 minutes of free calls. Where there is not in-cell telephony, we've also made provision for access to locked mobile handsets, so that they have that facility as well. And there is also access to the email a prisoner facility on all sites. So I hope that assists. With respect to the questions from the Noble Lord Harris, I've already indicated that the proportion of frontline prison officers staff working is at about 78 to 80%. I've mentioned already the statistics on this. And as regards advice to families, if a prisoner is removed to hospital with COVID-19, or if he's so ill that he cannot himself consent to inform his family of his condition, then steps would be taken to inform the family. But otherwise, it would be a matter for the prisoner to determine clearly whether or not he wished to make such a disclosure. And with regard to the question of the investigation of death raised by Lord Harris, the Prison and Probation Ombudsman is still investigating all deaths in prison. And on 26 March, the Chief Coroner published his guidance on COVID-19, which made clear how important it was that deaths in custody should be scrutinised carefully, and that there should be sufficiency of inquiry. The Noble Lord McNally raised the question of the various briefings that have been received, and if I can adopt shorthand, I'm happy to write responding to the points made in those briefings. I will write to him and place a copy of my letter in the library. The Noble Lord Ramsbottom raised the question of single cells that I've touched upon, and also about families being kept informed, which I've also touched upon. There is in addition, of course, the urgent line, which can be accessed through the Gov.uk website for families who wish to make urgent inquiries about prisoners. The Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Gloucester, raised the question of pregnant women, and of course they are featured in the release scheme that was announced on 31st March. But we have to keep at the forefront of our minds the issue of public safety, and therefore we cannot simply have an unlimited release of women because they are pregnant and in custody. As regards the ability of children to have telephone contact with those in custody, I've already indicated that we've taken steps to improve telephone contact. The Noble Lord Farmer raised a number of questions, and if I can touch upon them briefly. As I've indicated, we have improved provision for virtual visits as by improving telephony. There is also an iPad to every site for compassionate video calls, and we are extending the email a prisoner facility to all sites. As regards the suspension of prison visits, that will be lifted in accordance with such guidance as we can receive from Public Health England and in accordance with operational assessments. And as regards contact, as I indicated before, information is available to families about how they contact prison if they have urgent concerns about an individual in custody. The Noble Lady Baroness Healy suggested that there would be no need for risk assessments and release without them, but I simply cannot agree with that proposition. The Noble Lady Baroness Humphreys asked if we had separate statistics in respect of those in Welsh prisons and COVID numbers in Welsh prisons as distinct from the rest of the estate, and I don't have those numbers. I will make inquiry to see if they can be identified as a separate statistic, and if they can, I shall let her know what the then current numbers are. I will write to her and place a copy of the letter in the library. The Noble Lady Baroness Bennett suggested that we should have a daily report of COVID cases in the prison estate. We in fact do have that, and it's available and is made by way of a press release. She asked how many people were due for release in the next 12 months. That is not the measure that we've applied under the release scheme. We are concerned with those who are due for release in the next 2 months, and that will remain the position. The Noble and Learned Lord Wolfe raised the question of remand prisoners. I have to say that that is not a matter for the Ministry of Justice. That is a matter for the judiciary, and therefore we don't feel that we're in a position to address that. The Noble Lord Dobbs raised the question of single cells, and I've touched upon that, and the pregnant mothers, and I've touched upon that as well. The Noble Lord Buff referred to the Prison Officers Association, and certainly can I say that from a ministerial point of view, I'd want to commend the cooperation that we've had from that association in dealing with this crisis within the prison estate. And I say that without qualification. And when they suggest that we should remember them, namely the frontline staff, I entirely agree. They are the hidden heroes in this context. He raised the question of testing, which I believe I've touched upon, lack of PPE, which is not at this stage critical. And he said, are they key workers? They are key workers. We regard them as key workers. They're generally regarded by the government as key workers. They will be tested as key workers. And I certainly hope that supermarkets will have regard to their position in that context.
It's time to wind up, Lord King.
It may be, and I shall wind up in about 1 minute, if I may. The Noble Lord Marks raised the question about prisoners being outside cells, but clearly we've got to maintain social distancing at the present time. The Noble Lord Ponsonby, who I welcome to his new position on the opposition front bench, that the worry of officers taking home the COVID virus. I can understand their concerns. I would join him in congratulating Centre Parks for the position they've adopted with regard to that matter. It's clearly going to be of considerable assistance. I do not recognise his reference to the removal of prisoners to care homes. I'm not aware that that does occur, but I will make further inquiry. On that point, can I say that we are carrying out all the steps that we consider are appropriate as advised by Public Health England. We are developing robust contingency plans. We are relying upon an enormously dedicated and resilient staff in order to maintain the prison estate. We are, of course, concerned with the welfare of the prisoners themselves, and we shall continue to be. I thank Noble Lords for their attention.
My Lords, the virtual proceedings will now adjourn until 6 p.m. for the government statement.